All right, we'll get started. I'm Bill Adair. I am the Knight Professor for Journalism and Public Policy at Duke University. I'm also the creator of PolitiFact, the fact-checking website in the United States. And I want to welcome you to our discussion today. This was something that Alexios and I talked about and proposed to Chris because I think both of us working in the fact-checking community have seen such an explosion of interest in fake news, and I had a concern about it, that it has become overblown, and so we started with the title for the panel and went from there. And so happy you could join us today for this discussion. I'm going to start by introducing our panel, and each of us will talk for about 7 minutes, sort of give our perspective on things. I will then ask some questions of other members of the panel. We'll talk a little bit and then invite you to join us in this conversation. And we expect the conversation to go beyond just answering that question, is fake news overblown, and to get into some of the larger issues of trust, of the role of journalists in challenging accuracy even within other news organizations, and then talk about sort of where this is going next. We've spent, particularly in the United States, the past year with a lot of focus on fake news, and there is tremendous interest by foundations and other funders in conducting research about it, in funding ways to combat it, and all of this has had, I think, in many ways, some positive effects in journalism. But I also worry that our priorities are getting a little skewed. But first, let me start by introducing our panel. So, on my left, on your right, is Polly Curtis. Polly is the editor-in-chief of Huffington Post UK. Before that, you may know her from The Guardian, where she worked for 15 years as a reporter and editor, and was the creator of The Guardian's first live fact-checking blog. On my right, on your left, is Phoebe Arnold. Phoebe is the head of communications and impact at FullFact. FullFact is a fact checker in the UK, a real pioneer in a lot of ways. We've been working with them lately, joining in the effort to automate fact checking, and so fortunate to have Phoebe here. And on my far right is Alexios Mantzarlis. Alexios is the director of the International Fact-Checking Network at Poynter. The IFCN is the global association of fact-checkers that we started about 5 years ago. And Alexios, before that, was one of the founders of Pagella Politica here in Italy, a great fact-checker and a real leader in the global fact-checking movement. So thank you. So I'll kick off with just a few thoughts and why I wanted to have this discussion. I think we need to begin and see if we all agree on the definitions here. The term fake news has come to mean many things to many different people. And I think when we talk about it, we are typically referring to false news articles, often produced for profit by, I would say, kind of shady entrepreneurs, people who are trying to either make money from it or create misinformation. Are we in agreement on that definition?
In the purest sense.
Yeah. Now, of course, it's come to mean a lot of other things to different people in the United States. Donald Trump often refers to news organizations that he doesn't like as fake news. He will refer to individual stories as fake news. One of my students, Riley Griffin, did an analysis of this in the first 6 months of the Trump presidency and found that when Trump said fake news, that he was usually referring to stories about Russia and Russia's involvement in the U.S. elections. A more recent study, and Alexios, you may remember the specifics, talked about how many people believe that fake news is an accurate term to use to describe journalism they don't like, that they disagree with, so it really has come to mean a lot of different things to different people. So to pivot to our point here, I want to stipulate at the beginning that I think that fake news is a problem, and in the United States, we saw many news articles during the 2016 election, and it's probably wrong to call them news articles, that spread false things. No, Donald Trump was not endorsed by the Pope. There was, false news spread much more on social media, particularly on Facebook, and the studies show that people on Facebook are much more likely to share false news than accurate news stories. I want to stipulate from the beginning that it is a problem. My concern is that as someone working in the fact-checking community, I'm concerned that this has gotten our priorities out of whack. And I think that there has been so much attention on fake news that it misses that the serious problem was and remains politicians who lie and distort and deceive. That is a far greater problem today, just like it was a big problem years ago before we saw this growth of false news. And what concerns me is that there is so much attention and money on the fake news problem that I think we risk that news organizations that are doing fact-checking, that academics who are studying the impact of political news, of studying trust, studying people's beliefs, I think we risk that things are getting out of whack. And I hope that this can begin a discussion around the world of keeping things in perspective. And it's easy now to get excited about fake news because there seem to be new studies every week about it. But I worry that that has just gotten priorities out of whack. A couple other points that I'd like to make. One, I think part of the problem here is there's been a lot of emphasis on Twitter, and some of the studies have been based on how false articles have been spread over Twitter. And at least in the United States, Twitter is still reaching a relatively small percentage of people, but I think it represents a larger percentage of the academic research because the data is available. So I think we should realize Twitter is not real life, and that we should be wary about drawing conclusions from Twitter. One other point about who reads false news articles. So there's been some good academic research on who reads false news articles, and I haven't seen a study that says it's changing minds. It's not like people are reading these things and saying, "Oh wow, okay, now I'm going to vote for Donald Trump." It is reaching audiences that have already made up their minds. So, all right. So with that, why don't I turn to Phoebe, and why don't you? Polly's going first. Okay, I'm going to turn to Polly.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Thank you for having me. The question, has fake news been overblown? Yes, it absolutely has. It's way out of proportion. And I think if the chief proponent is Donald Trump, then I think we can all agree, yes, it's out of proportion. I'm more interested in whether it matters. And I think it really does matter because it plays into this idea and a feeling of mistrust in the press. And never have we needed facts more, never have we needed journalism more, and many audiences are disenfranchised, not connecting, and don't believe us. That's a huge problem, I think. I think it leaves us as journalists navigating two worlds of facts and feelings, and I think we need new skills to do that. Rational facts and then sometimes irrational feelings, but equally important in some ways. So I think that takes a whole new kind of set of skills and sophistication to get right. And I wanted to tell one story about my experience with fake news, not as a journalist, but last year, between the Guardian and HuffPost, I did a stint at the Red Cross as Director of Media in the UK. And during that period, we responded to the biggest news story, I think, of last year, and one of the most significant, which was the fire at Grenfell Tower in West London. And for those of you that don't know, this was a terrible disaster where a tower burnt down, 70 people died, and around 270 people lost their homes. Within hours of it happening, Red Cross was on the ground there, helping people, clothing them, giving them money, doing whatever we could to help. The government completely failed, particularly the local government. And it was a real failure of the state to help those people. And there was this incredible community response with everyone in West London, then everyone in London, then people from all over the country driving to West London and giving these donations. And this kind of donation mountain built up of clothes and toiletries and baby equipment. And it was piling up, and suddenly there was too much for the people that needed it. So as the Red Cross, we went in and distributed to the people that needed it, and then collected everything else. And the Royal Mail gave us this depot that's used for Christmas, and is empty the rest of the year. And we brought all the donations to this depot, and there were 3 football pitches worth of donations. It was an incredible, incredible sight. We decided the best thing to do with the stuff that wasn't needed was to sell it in our shops, with every penny going back into the Grenfell Disaster Fund. Meanwhile, on the ground, a story started to emerge that we had stolen the donations and that we were going to profit from them ourselves. And this was my challenge as Director of Media. How do I convince the people on the ground who need our help that we have not stolen it, that we're helping as much as we can? And there was in particular one social media influencer, a DJ, who was really kind of fueling this idea. And you could track kind of where the information was coming from, and a lot of it was from this particular one woman. And I spent like 2 days at one point chasing her around West London, trying to convince her, having face-to-face conversations, trying to convince her. And it mattered at that point because some of the victims were starting to say to us, we won't talk to you because we don't trust you. So it was interfering with if it was just a reputation problem, we could live with it, but it was affecting our ability to respond. So eventually, we managed to get to this woman, have the conversation, couldn't change her mind. It wasn't, we weren't going to win this. And I had a conversation with one of my international colleagues who is used to responding to earthquakes and war zones. And he said, but what are you doing? Why don't you have community liaison people as part of your disaster response? Why aren't you working with the community? Like, community liaison is finding those influencers and then involving them in decisions. And we said, but we're the British Red Cross, and we're in Britain, and we're in London, and we know these people. This is our people. And it was a real kind of moment of recognition that actually we were completely out of touch with the people in our own city. And I think I kind of tell that story because I think that idea of community liaison is now quite important for journalists to understand, involve, and be part of the communities and world that they're reporting on, in order to report on those feelings as well as those facts.
Great. Thank you. That was really
you.
interesting. Phoebe.
Hello, thanks very much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. So I'm Head of Communications and Impact at Full Fact. Part of my job is about trying to get people who've said things that are wrong to stop saying them. So that's kind of where I come to this conversation from. So Full Fact, could I possibly have the thingy? Thank you, no worries. Cool. So Full Fact's been fact-checking since 2010, and we fact-checked 3 elections and 3 referendums. And I think we're quite unusual within the fact-checking community internationally in that we check politicians, but we also check media claims, claims from lobby groups, claims from charities. And more recently, we've been getting into online memes and images, because that's where a lot of people are going to get their news now. So we have this quite interesting overview of the sort of where inaccurate and unsubstantiated claims are coming from across the full range of media. And we ran a really cool project with First Draft during the snap election last year, where we saw all sorts of mostly visual claims. It was this kind of thing. Not all of them were wrong. Not all of them could be called misinformation. The one on the right with the Jim Carrey grinning is actually basically correct. So I think it's just important to make that point. So I've been at Full Fact for 5.5 years, and it's been really interesting seeing how the conversation around fact-checking has changed. And we used to have to tell our funders stories about the harm done by misinformation. And we had this one story about knife crime. There was a bill going through Parliament about sentencing, and The Sun, one of the big tabloids, ran a front-page headline saying that almost all knife crime is committed by under-18s. And a really well-known actress, Brooke Kinsella, who was in EastEnders, one of the big soaps, her brother had tragically been killed by a stabbing at this time, so it became this really big topic of debate. It was a big topic in Parliament. And we fact-checked The Sun's claim that all knife crime was committed, half of all knife crime was committed by under-18s. And we found that this came from an estimate by one policeman in North London. But we have official statistics on this, and the real figure was about 20%. But unfortunately, by this point, the law had been altered. There had been an amendment to include under-18s in that bill. And I still wonder what the outcome would have been if those MPs had had the right information, if Full Fact had been more influential at that time and would have been able to stop that claim from circulating. But since then, we haven't really had to make the case for fact-checking in this way, talking about harms. Since there was all this discussion about post-truth politics and fake news, people are kind of taking it for granted that, you know, misinformation is bad and it causes harm. But we've been putting together a briefing for the UK government on some of this stuff, on our perspective, over the last 8 years. And one of the things that came up was types of harm, and it reminded me about the fact that we used to have to talk about this all the time to get any money, to get any attention. And these are the ones that we came up with. So people being wrong, you know, we have the equivalent of conversations in pubs, kitchen dinner tables, online, so in private conversations, on messaging groups. And I don't see those as having a huge amount of harm. I don't think it's the end of the world if people think things that aren't true. But obviously some of these have the potential to trend and go viral. And maybe that's where the harm comes in. Widespread misperceptions. Ipsos Mori have been doing really great work in their perils of perception research. They found across all different countries of the world, people have sort of wildly inaccurate views about things that happen in their country, about immigration, teen pregnancy rates, and so on. But I think in the UK, we have one interesting example from 2012, where there was a lot of inaccurate coverage of benefit claimants, people claiming welfare in the press. And we had a really sad email from a disability rights campaign group who were saying that since all this inaccurate information had been going around about their sort of group, there had been a rise in attacks on disabled people. And so that's, again, where you can see the real harm coming in from misinformation. Radicalization, the Rohingya propaganda has resulted in lots of violence against those people. We see things like attacks on Muslims, and this kind of crosses over into hate speech, but I think when it's inaccurate, it's part of our court as well. Bad information leading to bad decisions. I've already talked about the Sun and the knife crime sentencing bill. Election interference has kind of been well covered in the last few weeks. I don't need to go into that. Lack of respect and enthusiasm for evidence in policy making. So Tony Blair gave some evidence to the Leveson inquiry back in 2012, which was an inquiry into press ethics and practices. And he said that he'd had to change quite a lot of his policies on the European Union because of inaccurate information going around in the press. And I think this is a kind of really worrying trend, which we sort of saw a bit in the EU referendum. You know, we heard that people don't care about experts anymore. And I think we really need to guard the sort of trustworthiness and our respect for things like official statistics to make sure that we can have reasonable conversations that are rooted in reality. Distrust and disengagement, which I think Polly's talked about really well already. We know trust in government is low and stable. We've seen that Gallup poll from 1944, which found that a quarter of people thought politicians were out for themselves. So this isn't a new thing. People don't really trust politicians. And Ipsos Mori's Trust in Professions Veracity Index also shows trust in journalists, trust in politicians is low and stable. And I don't think that is misplaced trust. You know, we're asked all the time to believe things without being given any reasons to trust them. And then finally, the final harm, abuse of power. On principle, you just shouldn't be misleading people. So we have examples of all of these, but no proof of scale. I think Bill's kind of talked about that a bit. And you could certainly argue that politicians' day-to-day decisions have more impact than citizens merely sharing misinformation. And the point at which citizens become influential is at election time. You know, it's supposed to be once every 5 years in the UK, but that hasn't been the case. But I haven't seen any compelling evidence to suggest that people vote entirely based on facts. And, you know, we all know that emotions and tribalness come into it as well. And then finally, I just quickly wanted to talk about what the public thinks about all of this, because I think that's a really important part of the picture. So the Reuters Institute did some really good focus groups, which were written up by the Columbia Journalism Review. And they found that people talked about fake news as a spectrum or a question of scale. And asked to provide examples, they pointed to poor journalism, politicians who lie and exaggerate, as well as hyperpartisan news, and then, interestingly, also forms of advertising. And so the public has a really nuanced understanding of these issues. And I think we shouldn't forget what they see as fake news as well. And then another thing I wanted to bring to your attention. Populists every week do a poll about what news stories the public have noticed in the UK. And this is the week before the snap election, or of the snap election last year. So only 20% of people could name a story about the election itself, and 12% of people couldn't name anything at all. So I think when we're talking about all this, it's important to think about the harm that's being done, who's paying attention, what decisions are being made on the basis of information that's going around. Because I think that's a really useful way of thinking about why we cover what we cover as fact checkers and journalists. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Alexios.
Sorry, I was busy tweeting Phoebe's slide because it's really good. Hi, and thank you for being here this morning. I know it's 11, so not quite morning, but gradually as the days go by at IJF, the limit of when the morning is goes further down. But I have sensed the spectrum change. I've been working in fact-checking for 6 years now. I've been running the International Fact-Checking Network for 2.5 years. And in 2016, I was kind of like a hawk on fighting fake news. And now I'm probably on the dove side of the spectrum. And I don't think I've changed. I think what's happened has been the sort of the ground underneath me has changed. That there has been like maybe we were paying too little attention to the problem before, and now we're paying a little bit too much attention to the problem. I don't want to suggest that there isn't a systemic problem with how our online information ecosystem is structured. There is a huge problem with that infrastructure, and we need to be working with Facebook and Google to fix it. But what I'm confident and secure is being overblown is the effects of fake news on elections. If I see another headline that says fake news won Donald Trump the election, fake news won Brexiteers the election, I will stop reading newspapers. I won't. But we have no evidence that People were brought to the ballot box exclusively, primarily, principally because of fake news. We have decades of research that actually it's really fucking hard to figure out what makes people vote one way or another. And yet we keep shouting that we know for certain this thing or the other. And we do this despite, thankfully, this increased attention on fake news has meant an increased amount of research on fake news. This is something that I'm very grateful about, that academics are turning their attention to it. And yet, every time a study comes out on this topic, we cover that same study in the same hyperbolic manner of OMG, fake news are, drowning the truth, lol, nothing matters. And so I'll give 3 examples. Some of you may have seen the MIT study a couple of weeks ago published on Science, right? Wonderful study looking at years of Twitter data. And the headline for that study, as it was reported around, even from expert journalists, was falsehoods beat the truth on Twitter. Study, right? No chance for the truth on Twitter. Fake news overwhelms truthful news. Except the sample of that study didn't compare true news and false news. It compared stories fact-checked as true and stories fact-checked as false. I hope you see the distinction between those 2 things, right? No, not every true story gets fact-checked, right? In fact, the majority of true stories go out uncovered by the fact-checkers. So for instance, for years, the most retweeted tweet in the history of Twitter was Barack Obama hugging Michelle Obama under the headline, 4 more years. That wasn't fact-checked by fact-checkers, right? And so covering that study in this sort of very misleading frame leads us all to sort of throw our arms in the air, give up, and say, whatever, nothing matters. And thankfully, and this I think has a hint of a solution, the researchers were very responsible of sort of being on Twitter, saying, hey, this is not quite what happened, this is what did happen. And I think that's, academics in this space are going to have a responsibility to rein in their press release teams and to sort of look at how the narrative covers their studies. Couple more studies that I want to mention. One in January, Brendan Nyan, Jason Reifler, Andrew Gass looked in what was a very unique study, because a lot of these studies are actually lab, right? And there aren't real life, quote unquote. But this study was actually conducted following the browsing habits of a bunch of Americans, and found that, hey, that echo chamber that we've been talking about obsessively for the past couple of years, maybe not quite as hard as we thought. That half of the people who were subjected to fake news stories were also subjected to fact checks. So yes, sure, there were people who only saw fake news, but were not quite as distinct as we thought it was. Many caveats. I don't have the time to go through them. It's not as sort of rosy as I am going to have the time to explain. But again, the coverage of that study from the New Yorker down was, this is another example of fact-checking being ineffective. So I think we need to draw many little lessons from these studies and not use them as an inevitable news peg for this real narrative of, we're drowning, run for the hills, be desperate. And I think the problem is that with this framing, we are drawing an interest in over-regulation, in over-legislation. It feels like there's a call for anyone who can do something to do something. And when that is maybe legislators who can't tell that you don't send an email on WhatsApp. That's an actual question from a senator to Mark Zuckerberg the other day. Or who think, as the Italian Minister of the Interior in the previous government thought, that the police should be fact-checking and set up a unit where you could send your fake news stories, who and how they were skilled to do this work, and who and how we think that law enforcement will be trusted to do this kind of stuff is beyond me. And increasingly, it's also risks sort of poisoning the well for most fact-checking in the EU, I think, because increasingly we're seeing it framed as fact-checking is our only arm against Russian interference. there's, newsflash, there's a lot of false information spread by pro-EU politicians, by pro-EU outlets, and the more we frame it as just across a polarizing divide line, we risk making actual fact-checkers work much harder. So just to wrap up and sort of return to what Bill was saying about political claims as well, I'm seeing a lot of media outlets around the world sort of jumping into debunking misinformation and false news. I think that's great. I would invite all of them to also jump into fact-checking political claims and political figures. They need to be held accountable. It's a little too easy to just target those terrible social media that aren't like us. We are media outlets, you can trust us, and a little too easy to sort of not go against actual political power and hold political power accountable, because that is what journalism should be doing. Thank you.
So to follow up on your point about, you wrote, I thought, really powerfully about the poor coverage of the MIT study. So what do we do? How do we encourage our colleagues who are writing about these studies to do it more accurately? Do we take an approach like Full Fact and call them up and be like, hey, that headline is wrong, that your lead, you misunderstood the study. Should we, and I guess the question is, who is we? Is it the IFCN? Is it you? Is it other academics? How do we push back on that?
You mean I need to offer a solution? Sort of like complaining isn't enough? Okay. No, I think we need to tackle this a bit systemically. And so we need to start the very outset from the academics, tell them that, hey, I understand you need to get funding for this research, and I understand that you are maybe on a tenure track, and therefore all news clips count, and therefore, but there's a responsibility to make sure that this works and this is communicated well. At the next level, there are, and I sort of touched on this a little bit, press offices for universities. There is some work on health studies. There's a great debunking site called Health News Review that looks at press releases on health studies and what universities put out. But I think I could almost see like a fact-checking site on press releases on all academic studies, because obviously they want to entice us and put catchy headlines. Because then when you finally reach to the journalists are like, well, the source is this reputable university. What are you telling me? Not that absolves them, but there's sort of, I think, also a couple of steps before. I don't know. I think maybe really just bringing academics and journalists in the room together and having each understand what the sort of incentives are for overemphasizing results. And in a structured journalism way, I would love a world in which we actually are able to say, have all these studies tagged and say, this is also all the other studies that are related to this study, right? What other things has this researcher published on this? What has come out on the topic of fake news and elections in the past year? Just so to give readers a bit of a richer understanding. And I know it takes a lot more time and it's not as catchy, but I guess just good slow journalism would be a good start.
Phoebe, I'm curious for Full Fact, how, what's the mix of fact-checking that you're doing? How much is on political figures, either people or organizations? How much is on news organizations? And how much is on sort of viral or false news articles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something I've been pushing internally at Full Fact. So just because we've had so many elections and referendums, we've done a lot of fact-checking of politicians and parties, and not enough of journalists. So we're about to launch a project, fact-checking front pages, for the next 3 to 6 months, and kind of seeing what we find from that. And also thinking about when we do ask for corrections, which we inevitably will, what kind of response we get from that, and whether we can make people's newspapers' corrections processes better, which I think will be the case.
And what about fake news? Do you all do much debunking of those things, or is that more sort of focused when you get close to an election? How much of that do you do?
Yeah, definitely when we get closer to an election, we have a lot more resources. So with the first draft project I mentioned, we were able to set up a big monitoring kind of operation looking at things like Facebook groups, Twitter, like newspapers online. It was like a whole range of things, I think Reddit as well. But that's not really sustainable. That took kind of 8 people looking at that for 8 weeks to kind of get enough information that we could see what was actually the most important thing to check. But we get a lot of reader requests as well, people kind of who've seen stuff through WhatsApp or Facebook, and we try and check as much of those as we can.
Cool. Polly, you raised a really important question that partly caused by, I think, the concern about fake news, but also just a byproduct of this crazy, chaotic information age we're in, and that is trust. And you talked about getting audiences to believe us. Your example that the radio talk show host just wouldn't believe you. And you talked about how Huffington Post has tried to do much more outreach. Do you think that's effective? Is that something that we need to scale and do more of through, for all news organizations? How do we get people to believe us in this time when, there's so many different sources of information, some trustworthy, some not?
If you think about fake news having poisoned the journalists well, we discussed earlier there being kind of buckets of different kinds of fake news. And I think one of those buckets, I think that is on that continuum, is news that people don't relate to and don't feel is right. And I think that comes from 2 things that give us kind of potential solutions. One is that we are not like the communities we serve as journalists, too white, too middle class, too London-centric in the UK, too out of touch with most of the country. And the other is, I think, something that's a real kind of structural change that happened with the kind of flourishing of digital journalism. Newsrooms came under so much pressure, particularly legacy newsrooms, I think. We were serving so many different beasts, and I think an effect of that was just we didn't leave the office enough. We just didn't go out. And places like HuffPost that were set up as aggregators and a blogging network as well, but, we were established as aggregators. It wasn't kind of part of our model to really go out and report. And that's what we're really focusing in on now. If we want to understand our audience, we need to be out there and part of it. So that's a big change that's come at HuffPost since Lydia Polgreen took over in America and I took over in the UK. Lydia did this fantastic thing where she put the newsroom on a bus and went around Trump America and made them just get out of the office and have conversations. And we've looked at that and are kind of doing a UK version, which is really just hiring reporters outside London. But that thing about digital journalism becoming more and more office-based, one of the really fascinating things I've seen is in hiring our first reporter in Birmingham. We've been talking a lot to the local newspaper there so that we don't just land kind of with no relationships. So we're talking about partnerships, those kind of things. And actually, the concerns they have as a local newspaper even are pretty similar. They're kind of re-establishing beats, local beats, which I thought I thought that was local journalism. But in local journalism where they've been doing papers and digital, people have become more and more office-based even at a local level. So I think kind of, for me, the 2 answers are be more like our audience and talk to our audience more, kind of shoe leather reporting. And I think there's a kind of data analytics side to that as well, where you can kind of get into understanding your audience better through better data. But nothing beats going out and reporting.
It's like I always say to my students, grab a notebook and go talk to people. Because I think there's a tendency, whether it's student journalists or adult journalists, to just kind of sit in your office and type and, sort of opine and gaze at the ceiling and like, hey, go talk to people, interview someone, And
Do you know what, I think that is really fascinating, because I went from The Guardian, where I was often one of the youngest people in the room, to being really old in my office. And I've got this fantastic team of really young journalists. And I'm really struck by how much less they pick up the phone, let alone leave the office. They're communicating by email and Slack and, actually talking to people. And I've even realised that, like, my instinct, if there's something going on, is to give them a call and talk about it. And they're quite kind of nervous of talking on the phone even. It's like, and they're completely brilliant journalists, but there's a cultural difference there for people who are complete digital natives.
At the risk of this panel becoming retitled Kids Today, but I totally agree. So, Phoebe, you talked about the Reuters Institute study on fake news. And so talk a little bit about that, because when I looked at that slide, and I remember when the study came out, I guess my concern was, again, that this term fake news has been so distorted, so misused, and that I think we need to be specific in what we're talking about. Did you take from that study that people will understand those nuances, and that they realize that the term's been so misused?
I think I'd maybe think about it more in terms of trust in public debate. And yeah, I think we're always being asked to kind of trust things without really being given reasons to trust them. So I guess that's why Full Fact always sources everything, and we provide lots of information about our funding and that kind of thing. And there's a really great philosopher, Honora O'Neill, who's also sits in the House of Lords in the UK. And she did these Wreath lectures in, I think, 2002. And she said that we shouldn't be placing trust blindly like small children. We should be placing informed trust. And to do that, we need information and the means to judge that information. And that's kind of where Full Fact is coming from with all of this. And I think it's true of things that politicians say, advertising, things that journalists are telling us, that we should always be giving people reasons to trust and information to judge what we're saying is credible.
Alexios, you talked about the infrastructure and the need to improve the infrastructure. By that, do you mean that social media platforms need to do a better job of kind of filtering when there is false content? Sort of talk a little bit about that and where you'd like to see that go. And I guess if you could just answer this question, would you like to see data from Facebook indicating the effective? This is sort of a running point that Alexios has made once or twice before.
Yeah, a couple of thousand times. So the infrastructural problem is really the sole novelty, right? It's full of examples of misinformation, of hate-filled misinformation, of crappy journalism pretending to be good fake news in itself isn't the new phenomenon. The phenomenon is that it can reach millions unfiltered from whichever point and person. And so unless and until that changes, so unless and until how we surface content on Google and Facebook has signals indicating the likely accuracy of that content, we're going to be stuck. And so, to their partial credit, Facebook and Google are understanding this more and more and are trying to act on this, probably too slow. But the question of, can we make sure that those same photos that come out during breaking news situations just don't reach thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people is a technical problem very, very many times. I think Facebook could be even much more muscular and hire 100 fact checkers internally for breaking news situations on top of the partnerships it has with external fact checkers. But we need to remember that Google is part of it too, right? That as our major interface to obtaining facts, none of us, if we want to like sort of check whether someone was born at a certain time or where someone is from, you don't go on a fact-checking website, right? You Google it. And so, and for too long, that type of information, I always have this silly example. I'm sorry for those of you who may have heard it 12 times, but you know, my wife was pregnant at the very start. We didn't know what she could eat safely. We Googled this cilantro safe to eat. We were at a Mexican restaurant, and of course, the top comment featured snippet by Google was some rando anonymous blogger on Baby Center saying, yes, cilantro will kill the baby, it will kill the mother, it will kill the father, run. And so that's a pretty, you know, that's an infrastructural problem. Of course, just as to wrap up, as Facebook and Google do these things, they can't just hold on to their nice little lessons about how it's all going, right? Facebook now has been conducting the largest experiment in combating online misinformation in history since December 2016, and we still know close to nothing about it because they have not yet published the data about it. That is valuable data for researchers, it's valuable data for public policymakers, it's extremely valuable data for fact checkers to get better at our jobs.
So if we agree with the thesis that there's too much emphasis on fake news, how do we as fact-checking organizations keep our eye on the ball and still sort of resist the sexiness, the money, to keep checking politicians? And I mean, it sounds like you guys have done that.
I think it's probably, yeah, it kind of goes back to harm and the question of who's seeing it all. And I suppose the problem with misinformation outside of America is that there haven't been that many studies about the reach, the scope and scale of the problem. And so I think at Full Fact, obviously, we're always trying to use evidence to make decisions. So we've been a bit reluctant to kind of get too distracted by this question. But yeah, there's a lot of money in it. And I think this is kind of why I'm trying to bring the conversation back around to harms and kind of thinking about those earlier conversations we were having with funders. If and when this all blows over, we're going to have to go back to talking in that way and kind of really making the case for why fact-checking matters.
And
sorry.
Yeah, chime in.
I just wanted to 100% agree with that and say, because we've been thinking about this a lot, sort of two metrics, two things that fact checkers should consider. One is something that Africa Check, a great website based out of South Africa, does, is ask itself, what impact would it have unchecked, right? So considering all these harms, you know, Pope endorses Donald Trump. Honestly, what impact is that going to have? Just let it, you know, be frivolous. Donald Trump saying the unemployment rate is 40% and sort of sowing doubt on one of the key indicators and statistics of our society is a much more harmful thing. And the second thing is reach. I think we need to become a lot more sophisticated in measuring how many people are likely to have seen or to see this. And of course, with again, the American example is a bit too banal and obvious, but with Donald Trump's tweets, that's already like, you know, millions of people. And so that, I think these are the sort of two questions that we need to be asking at all times.
Totally. You know, we were talking about the number of people reached by falsehoods in President Trump's State of the Union address far eclipsed the number of people who are being reached by these false articles. So why don't we turn it over to questions or comments from you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to disagree with us, and you know, love to hear what you're thinking. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Shane Greenup. I'm an independent working on a project called the Socratic Web. Bill, in your introduction, you mentioned the idea of fake news being overblown because is this fake news story going to change someone to being a Trump supporter, to voting for Trump? And Alexios, you sort of said that. It's like, how much influence do these articles have? The research shows we don't know much about what causes people to turn out. My concern with fake news is not the black and white on or off effect of an article. I think the concern is the consequence of it over years. And so that the Pope article, what effect does that have? It may be the final straw that breaks the camel's back on someone who's not on the fence but Catholic. And then they find out the Pope endorses Donald Trump, that's all I needed. Or it could just be another fact that they hold in their head so that a year down the line they go, well, he's got this, he's got that, he's got this, and the Pope endorses him, I may as well. Because, yeah, so how much do you guys think about that aspect of fake news, the accumulation effect?
Sure, the sort of corrosive effect over time.
Bingo.
Alexios, you want to take that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Shane. I think what concerns me more than sort of the micro level thing, because again, I think switching decisions is really, really difficult to measure. There was a study looking at whether people's minds change when fact-checked on claims, and Trump supporters' minds did change when fact-checked, but their voting intentions did not, right? So it's really hard to decide like what that. But I see a great corrosive effect is this sort of like a pox on all your houses, right? The information ecosystem is all so noisy, it's all so crappy that I'm just gonna distrust and disbelieve most of the stuff. And that's, I'm not a Russian scholar, but having read some, I understand that disinformatia worked this way, right? It wasn't so much a question of, hey, you need to trust me, but hey, everything around you is something you kind of need to navigate with doubt and skepticism and cynicism, not skepticism. And so that, I think, is where the corrosive effect kicks in.
As someone who comes from a scientific background, I hate seeing this about science in the media. Scientists say beer will make you live forever. And then the public starts going, scientists don't know what they're talking about. The scientists never say that, like the academic research thing you were mentioning.
Just don't ask the scientists about cilantro. Do you agree? I mean, gets to your point about the corrosive effect leads to things like they wouldn't believe what was in that warehouse. So how do we combat this corrosive effect because it's sort of a diffuse problem. It's not like we can say, well, this fact check was right. How do we restore this trust on a grand scale, given the fact that many people think it is fake news if they're reading an article they disagree with, or they're reading an article where they think there's a mistake in it?
Well, I mean, I think I have like huge respect for all the fact-checking organisations, and as I've worked as a fact-checker myself, and it was one of the most rewarding jobs I ever had, really. And but I think the point is, it's a real indictment on journalism that we need fact-checkers on journalism. You know, fact-checking is absolutely central to every kind of journalistic endeavour. So the fact that we've had to kind of have this flourishing trade in fact checkers is like, it's a real shame on us, I think.
I wonder if the solution to this is more transparency, more what my colleague Mark Stencil calls discovery journalism, where we sort of take the reader along as we learn things. Like Donald Trump said this, we wondered if it's true. We called this person, he said this. We called this person, she said that. And sort of take people along and show them how thorough we are as journalists.
So that's the fact-checking live blog I ran kind of 8 years ago or something was exactly that. The point of it was working with readers to test a big news theme of the day. So we asked a question in the morning, didn't provide the answer, but provided the kind of claim in the morning. I went about my kind of journalistic endeavour in trying to establish the truth around that, kind of documenting my journey in a live blog, and then bringing up comments from below the line. And with a kind of distribution strategy around that plugged into the right networks for that story. If it was a tech story, we'd tweet it from the tech account. If it was a home affairs story, a home affairs editor would tweet it. You would suddenly, you know, each day you could kind of click into a different expert group that would help you answer that question. And one of the reasons it was such an incredibly rewarding job is that the readers loved it. They loved that process of being engaged and the openness of it. There were downsides. It's a very slow way of doing journalism. You know, it's easier for me to kind of find the expert than to negotiate. Sometimes below the line felt like a massive therapy session. But, you know, I think that was one of the reasons people liked it as well, that kind of engagement and conversation around how you do journalism, really.
Sure. Let's see, actually over here, yeah.
Hi, Nick Newman from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. So maybe a comment first and then a question. So the comments about the focus groups that we did, and actually we've done some more this year, which have been fascinating because it didn't come up spontaneously last year. So obviously poor information did, but not necessarily the term fake news. This year it came up. So essentially spontaneously in all the countries we looked at. So, you know, that awareness, the way the media have covered it, is in turn sort of feeding back and colouring it, which I think is worrying. But the same themes come up essentially. You know, there is a massive disconnect between public views of fake news and the narrative that we have here in these conferences or that politicians are talking about. And that's pushing us towards probably the wrong answers and over-regulation, all things that you talked about. So I think having a clearer sense of what the problem is, which is about, you know, all of those things together, splitting them up and being clear about them is critical. The question is really, so far fact-checking in terms of how it's being integrated within Google and Facebook has been done. You know, as you search, you then come up with these things, and they've tried to integrate it, and there's a problem of visibility. But one of the things that the media companies, one of the things that the platforms are doing now is to try and take those signals and affect the value of the source as it is then ranked within Google or within Facebook. So Huffington Post, for example, might be downgraded because they've asked about the trust of, or upgraded because they've asked the trust of the brand. And fact-checking signals might be used to affect what we see. So I'm interested to know, A, do you think that's a really significant development as it begins, and what dangers you see in taking this purely at the brand level?
I mean, we have to start incorporating signals, right? Like that's otherwise the infrastructure will keep, especially on Facebook, leaning heavily on emotion, where the single monetizable event is an emotional event, the like, the share, whatever. On Facebook, actually, that's where signals have already started being implemented for about a year and a half, and now increasingly around the world. That if a news item or story, a post, has been found to be false by the fact checkers, so flagged as such, it gets reduced reach. We don't know how much that reach has been reduced, what that means compared to its usual reach. So I think that's happening. I think it needs to be at the most granular level possible, because once you start saying this is a disinformer, then it just like casting aspersions on an entire brand person or page rather than on a single item, that becomes problematic. I also think we don't need to overcorrect there either. So we should make sure that these stories don't reach over a certain limit, right? So that Facebook should be cutting down, but not that they suddenly all vanish or that we cut down entire pages' reach dramatically. This is where, again, broken record, if Facebook shared data, we'd have a sense of how much that matters versus how much the warning that this story was flagged as false matters to readers. My suspicion is that the most important effect will be algorithmic rather than necessarily human, but I don't know. And I'm be glad to learn that I'm wrong. But yeah, signals are important. We need to play very, very carefully. You know, there was a mistake with Google earlier this year that erroneously flagged a couple of right-wing blogs on stories they hadn't fact-checked. That's the kind of misfire that we really can't afford.
Yeah, I think it's really important to avoid that the definitions of good journalism to bad journalism, whatever signals we're using, need to respect partisanship and opinion publications that you know are an important part of the spirited political discourse. I think it's also good to realize that there are different consumers of those signals. So advertisers can be more discerning and say, well, we're not going to advertise on these kind of sites. And so I think it's a good idea that, there's been talk about, and several ventures are trying to identify what are the false news sites and which are the sites that spread false information. Advertisers can be more selective than, say, a platform like Facebook or Google, and in terms of what they rule out. I think I really like Alexios's point about granular and sort of looking at the article level rather than casting an aspersion and saying, well, that site has published 6 false stories in the last 6 months, therefore we can't trust it, and so we have to tread carefully in that area.
Just following on from that, I also think the definition of trust, and when you ask people about trust, is really, really important, because Breitbart readers trust Breitbart because it affirms all of their views. HuffPost readers, core readership, trusts HuffPost because it has quite an open and very almost kind of kinder approach to journalism. So I think kind of the legacy of us having that solutions-focused journalism, a really open bloggers network, has actually kind of made people feel like it's an approachable and less cynical news brand. Now, I'm not going to pretend that HuffPost has a legacy of standards that would match the New York Times. That's definitely the direction we're going in. But I think trust means very different things in different contexts. Guardian readers treat The Guardian like a Bible, but they're probably The Guardian's biggest critics as well. It's a complete love-hate relationship.
I think you're right to bring that up. I think the question of trust them to do what, and that's, I think the interesting thing about the Facebook survey is that it wasn't saying, do you trust them to tell the truth? Do you trust them to kind of support your views? I don't know, it was a bit vague. But going back to Nick's original point about Google and Facebook and their various kind of fact-checking schemes, as far as I know, they haven't really gone out and asked fact-checkers, is this actually what you think would be useful if we were starting this from scratch? And Full Fact has been asking them to do things like enable corrections notices on posts. So if a story has been put out, being able to flag to anyone who's liked it or shared it that story has changed, that would be a huge change. And particularly on Twitter, you can't correct a tweet, you can't edit it once you've sent it. So I think there are lots of ideas that fact checkers and practitioners working in these areas would have, which haven't really been listened to. I think it would be great if we could have some projects that were starting from scratch, from the beginning, working in collaboration with people who do have expertise in this.
Mark Frankel from the BBC. I just wanted to pick up, I think you've made some fantastic points about reach and the fact that so much stuff is either not seen or seen for the wrong reasons. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about amplification and algorithms, because essentially, if we're reliant on the debunk and the fact bus to be more visible, we're also reliant on those social media algorithms to boost it. And I think we're in danger of trying to come up with solutions that, frankly, are never going to be implemented, because without the power of those platforms and companies giving a positive boost to what you've actually produced and making it more visible and downplaying, in a business sense, the stuff that's emotive and connecting with people that people will always want to share because they're titillated or fascinated for all the wrong reasons that we've discussed, what's likely to change?
Sure. Great point. And I tell you that in the case of Google, they are, I think, doing a better job of promoting fact-checking. And this grew out of an idea from Glenn Kessler, the fact-checker at the Washington Post, who told Google back in 2015, why don't you start tagging fact checks in search results? And so the Google executive, you mentioned this too, was intrigued. I think it's something they probably had already been thinking about some. And so we were brought in at Duke to help work with Google and schema.org and develop a tagging system for fact checks that we developed that's called Claim Review. And Claim Review is a schema that anyone who publishes can use to tag fact checks. And then we created, to make it easier on the fact checkers, a project called Share the Facts, where they can create this claim review and a little visible widget that goes in their articles. What Google has done with that is encouraging. If you do a search and there is a fact check that's related to it, that fact check will get highlighted. And it will show up as what Google calls a rich text snippet. So it'll have the statement, the name of the fact-checking organization. And so it distinguishes it in search results. Anecdotally and from what we've heard from the fact-checkers, the schema has elevated how fact checks show up in Google search results. So fact checkers are getting more traffic. People are seeing more fact checks. And I think that's an encouraging first step. Google has also highlighted fact checks in Google News using this schema that we developed. And so I think that's a great first step. There's also now, depending on what country you're in and what device you're using for Google News, there is a fact check box that where fact checks show up. So we're getting there. I'd love to see more use of that schema by Facebook. I think there's an opportunity there. There's also an opportunity for what you're suggesting, which is the linkages between the fact checks and the original false content. Some of the fact checkers are putting those putting in URLs to the original content, and that has the potential in search results to show up a speech and then have underneath it, here are fact checks of that speech, or an article, oh, here's a fact check of that article. So progress, encouraging, but it's still early. Yes, down here.
To talk about cilantro. I'm the Director of Communications at the European Food Safety Authority. So you Google cilantro pregnancy, you get, style craze, and then you get the Huffington Post. And the only way to get something sensible, the Huffington Post, quite a good sort of balanced report, but is to put the source. So it's to know that there is a European Food Safety Authority, that there is, NHS or Ministry of Health. So the way is, and we discussed it this morning in the previous session, to look at the popularity versus credibility criteria to lift views. But the question is, what is the role of public administrations and scientific organizations? And how can we better work with the fact-checking organizations? There's the high-level group on misinformation that has some quite bland recommendations. But in practice, what can we start doing?
I could maybe go first for this, because Full Fact does a lot of work with bodies that produce kind of robust quality information in the UK, so we work a lot with the Office for National Statistics and statisticians who work in government departments but are independent of ministers. And we also work with the House of Commons Library, various expert groups like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Migration Observatory, which is at Oxford. And I think one of the things we've been pushing is for an equal emphasis to be placed on communication as well as analysis, and I think that is now kind of starting to percolate through. And we've done kind of, work with hundreds of statisticians saying, could you move this one caveat from page 6 to page 1? And then we've seen a drop-off in inaccurate headlines because of that. Well, I think because of that. And I think encouraging these people, the people at the top of these organizations, to engage more with the public, think about how to build trust in a digital age. It's not all just one way anymore. You have to kind of have back and forth. You have to have back and forth to get people to trust you and see you as open. So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done, kind of building trust with especially younger audiences who are going to grow up, not, having many more sources of information and not necessarily trusting places like the Office for National Statistics, even though they are very trustworthy. And they do have a lot of quality assurance, they have a regulator, but you can't take it for granted anymore.
We got time for one more question. If we got anybody else? Otherwise, we'll end with a shameless plug by me. If you're interested in fact-checking, I'm doing a demo session this evening. I think it's at 6 p.m. about some of the things we're doing in automating fact-checking, tools that we've built and that are being used by fact-checkers in the United States, and some consumer tools that we've developed and are starting to use. So I think it's called Automation in Real Life. So we're thankfully beyond that phase where we're saying, imagine if, and we're now actually deploying things that are in use. So if you're interested, I hope you'll show up this evening. So I just want to thank the panel. This has been a great discussion, and thank you for coming.